in terms of analyzing the syntax, let me just make the larger point here. When you get to a paragraph of text, now you're going to be doing the same thing with the paragraph to some extent that you've done already. You're going to be looking for the theme. What is the theme of that paragraph, and how does that theme relate back to the section, back to the larger section, and so forth? So you're still looking at that. You've got that in mind, even as we're analyzing the syntax. The next step will be coming up with a preliminary theme. I'll show you in a few minutes, but you're still looking for that even as you're doing this, analyzing the syntax. So your major first step with the paragraph you're studying is to analyze the flow of thought, the syntax. Why is this important? Why is grammar important? Let me remind you of a, thank you so much, brother. Appreciate that. Because of the quote I shared with you by Luther, I think it's very insightful. He says, "First I shake the whole tree," that's the whole book you're studying, "that the ripest fruit may fall, and then I climb the tree and shake each limb, and then each branch, and then each twig, and then I look under each leaf." Again, not every message of Luther reflects that as clearly as we'd like, but he was right on his approach. He was right on his theory and his philosophy of approach. And that's what I love about that statement. So far, we've looked at the whole tree. We've looked at the book. We've even looked at the passage and the context. Now we need to look at each branch and twig. That is, we need to look at the phrases and clauses. So as you look at my little diagram over here, we've broken it into paragraphs. But now we're going to go down below the paragraph level, and we're going to break that paragraph into phrases and clauses to see the flow of Paul's thought within the context of each of those paragraphs. So we're still breaking it down. You're still bringing it, you're looking at the big and smaller detail. And so now we're going to analyze that paragraph by looking at its theme and its syntactical flow, by looking at the phrases and clauses. The syntax, let me just define that. Syntax is simply the relationship of clauses, phrases, and words to each other. That's all syntax is. The relationship of clauses, phrases, and words to each other. The way in which words are put together to form phrases, clauses, and sentences help us discover the author's intended meaning. That's how we communicate. Words isolated, for the most part, don't communicate anything. They have to be connected. And the way we connect those words, and of course that differs from Hebrew to Greek to English in some ways, but all of them have similarities. They all have clauses, they all have phrases, they all have words. What we're looking for is the relationship of those to one another. It's amazing how a simple grammatical reading of a single verse of Scripture can really open up its meaning to you. Now, before we consider the best tool for analyzing the syntax or the grammar of a passage, again, please don't panic, but let me give you just a very brief English grammar lesson. Because the same thing is true not only in English, but the same principles carry into the two original languages, primary two, Aramaic as well, but primarily two original languages that we study. All right? So, stick with me. I actually, when I was in graduate school, I taught English on the college level, and I'm going to try to make it really simple, okay? So see if this connects with you. First of all, you need to look, when you're looking at a syntactical analysis, you're looking at clauses and phrases. Clauses and phrases. That's what the P and C here stands for. In the paragraph, you're looking at phrases and clauses, phrases and clauses. Okay? So let's look at what these are. First of all, a clause is part of a sentence that contains a subject and a verb. There are two types of clauses. Santa wouldn't be one of them. Two types of clauses. First of all, independent clauses. This is a clause that expresses a complete thought or stands alone. It is a complete sentence. Here's an English example. Charlie ate supper. There's nothing missing to communicate meaning That is a full and complete sentence. It has a subject and a verb, and it is a complete thought. On the other hand, a clause can be a dependent clause. That is, a clause that does not express a complete thought and cannot stand alone. It's not a complete sentence. While Charlie ate supper, you can hear, and obviously that's not a complete thought. When Charlie ate supper, as Charlie ate supper, none of those are complete thoughts. They are dependent clauses. Dependent clauses provide support and meaning to independent clauses. So you're always looking and analyzing a paragraph. Where are the independent clauses and what are the dependent clauses that are adding meaning to those independent clauses? All right? That's the first thing you need to understand. Clauses. Part of a sentence that contains a subject and a verb, and either it's independent, it expresses a complete thought, or it's dependent, it does not express a complete thought. The second category you need to know is phrases. A phrase is defined as a group of words in a sentence, not a complete sentence, a group of words in a sentence without a subject and verb. You guys know what a subject and verb is. I mean, obviously, a subject is the doer of the action. A verb is either a state of being or a state of action. So this is a group of words in a sentence without a subject and a verb. There are several kinds of, actually two kinds specifically, of phrases. First of all, there's a prepositional phrase. These are really, really common, as you know. A group of words without a verb that is introduced by a preposition. Some of the common ones that aren't as obvious: of, with, and about. Those dominate the text of Scripture, particularly of. Way I taught my students, if you're doubtful about what a preposition is, it's anything that a squirrel can be to a stump or an airplane can be to a cloud. In, on, above, under, beside, etc. You get the idea. Anything that a squirrel can be to a stump or an airplane can be to a cloud, that's a preposition. And in addition, I've noted the ones that sort of don't fit that: of, with, and about. Okay? So if you've got that, you got prepositions. And a prepositional phrase is simply introduced by a preposition, and then it has some supporting words. Usually there's an object of the preposition, which is a noun. Okay? Or a pronoun. Now, let's go on to a second kind of phrase, and that is a verbal phrase. You got a prepositional phrase and a verbal phrase. This is it. Only phrases. So you got two clauses, independent, dependent, and you got two kinds of phrases. You got prepositional phrases, you got verbal phrases. Now, verbal phrases are a group of words without a main verb, but they're either a participle in which there is a verb form that functions like an adjective. There can be a present form of that. There can be a past form of that. The present form is the verb plus ing. The past form of that is the verb plus ed. Here are some examples. Present participle: hearing the phone ring, I answered it. What question does hearing the phone ring answer? Why, maybe. When? It's functioning like an adjective in the sentence. Past participle, verb plus ed. Stunned by the blow, Mike gathered his senses. Obviously, stunned by the blow is not a complete sentence. It's supporting the main part of the sentence. It's because it's a verb plus ed functioning as an adjective, we know it's a participle. The New Testament is filled, as you know, those of you in Greek, with participles. In addition to participles, there are gerunds. Verbal phrases, there's a gerund. And again, let me remind you that you're not going to be able to type everything I throw up here, but all of these slides I'll make available to you, the whole deal, at the end of the class. So do take notes supplement, but don't feel like you have to capture every word that's up here. Gerunds. A gerund is a verb form that functions like a noun. It's always a verb plus ing. Here's an example. Waiting for a text message kept me glued to my cell phone. In this context, waiting for a text message functions like a noun. Okay, you see that? The verb is kept. Waiting, kept. It's functioning like a noun in the sentence. A third verbal phrase is an infinitive. And this one's easy to recognize. It's to plus a verb. And it's used as a noun or an adjective. Used as a noun, they cannot be made to listen. Used there as the direct object of the sentence. Or an adjective. I need a book to read on holiday. There again, verb or to plus a verb. Now, those are important because what we're going to do in syntactical analysis is essentially we're going to break every paragraph down by its independent clauses, its dependent clauses, and its phrases to see the flow of Paul's thought, because that will allow us to follow his line of reasoning. The key to analyzing grammar, then, is you have to break the text into smaller units. You're going to break a paragraph into its smaller units. You're going to identify the main clause, the subject and verb of the sentence, the independent clause or clauses, and you're going to identify all the other phrases and clauses in that paragraph. And you're going to then work to understand their relationship to each other. Because remember, what's the main idea in the paragraph? Usually it's the independent clause. It's the clause with the subject and verb that is a complete thought that can stand alone. Everything else in that paragraph is supporting that. And so you want to see how is it supporting that. Now, what's the best tool to do this? You already know this. I've already sort of told you this. In Greek, you are learning or will learn the sentence diagram. Are you doing sentence diagramming in Greek? Those of you taking Greek? Yeah, that's a helpful tool. However, let me give you a little warning. That will help you identify the Greek parts of speech. But if all you do is sentence diagramming, in my experience, you will find that it tends to lead you to atomize the text, to atomize the paragraph, because you're looking at it differently than the original author did. He's looking at a paragraph, not necessarily at individual sentences. So you need to look at the paragraph. Remember, that's that one unit of thought. And that's the beauty of block diagramming. I've come to prefer, and I ask you to at least consider, and I know some of you are learning it, like I heard one of you learned it in your hermeneutics class, block diagramming. This is, by the way, why I assigned you Walt Kaiser's book, Toward an Exegetical Theology, to read, because he does a very good job of working through block diagramming. He shows you that, of course, he's focusing primarily on the Old Testament, if I remember right. So he's showing you it can be done in Hebrew as well as in English, and I promise you it can be done in Greek as well. Now, let me just say, I know Walt Kaiser's book's a little older. I know that some of his outlines that he drew from his block diagramming are outlines you and I would never preach, okay? I understand that, so I'm not saying look at sort of the fruit of all of that. I'm saying look at the block diagramming, because I think that is extremely helpful. When I was in seminary, I read Kaiser's book, and it revolutionized my approach to understanding the text. Because we all have the same desire, right? We all want to understand the original intent of the author. How do you get there? Well, here's how you get there. Because language has meaning because of the relationship of those clauses and phrases to each other. And if I can capture that, then I've captured his meaning. And so the best tool then is a block diagram. Block diagramming is so important to me at a personal level, I never, ever study a passage of Scripture without doing it. It doesn't diagram each sentence, but rather it diagrams the paragraph as a whole. Each phrase and clause is kept as you do the block diagram. It's kept in the natural order of the passage, whether you're doing in English or whether you're doing Greek or whether you're doing Hebrew. You keep, for the most part, I'll make one little exception just for clarity in a minute to show you. But for the most part, you keep the flow of the passage. And all you're doing then is you're showing by indenting what's the main idea and what are the supporting ideas. And it gives you then, it arranges the supporting phrases and clauses, indenting them under what they modify. And it eventually arranges all the material in a passage so that the relationships of whole sentences, clauses, and phrases are visually apparent at a glance. You can look at it and at your block diagram and have a picture of the flow of the author's thought. And as I mentioned, this is fully developed in Kaiser's book. Very helpful. It's also developed in other places. There are other resources. Richard Ramish, in his book on preparing an expository message, has a good section on this as well. There are other resources you look into. The quickest and the best way to do a block diagram is on your computer. In fact, let me just show you, let me just step away here from the PowerPoint and show you how I would do this. Okay, I go to my office on a Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock, I'm in my office, and I want to study the paragraph for that coming Sunday. I've done all of this work. By the way, let me just make one point, because one of the brothers asked me about this. This is not a block diagram, okay? I wrote this down here to show you you're going to break the paragraph down in block diagramming, but this is not a block diagram. This is just a sort of visual map of the section or the passage or the book. But now you're going to do a block diagram down at the paragraph level. That's what we're talking about. So just for a point of clarity. Now, let me show you what I do. I'm in my office, 6 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, got my cup of coffee, got my notepad, got my computer. I pray for illumination, confess my sin to the Lord, make sure that I have a heart and mind that wants to learn and study His Word. And then the very first thing I do is open the template that I've created for my sermon notes. That's something you ought to do, by the way, is you can, in word processing programs, create a template so that when you open it, all of the formatting that you prefer for your sermon notes is already there. You don't have to reformat every week and every sermon. Let me show you what that looks like. So I open Word in my computer, and I have under my templates one called Sermon Paper Final. And I click on Sermon Paper Final, and usually something happens. There we go. And this is what pops up. Now, first of all, we'll talk about sermon notes that you take into the pulpit. I use something that's, well, it's this size, okay? I use it in a binder because a couple of times I've preached outdoors or under fans, and loose leaf and fans and wind don't go along really well. And so it didn't happen, but a couple of times I said to myself, it's never happening again. Some of you preach from your iPads. I've done that. I don't mind preaching from my iPad, but I found marking my notes took more time on my iPad than it did with a pen and a marker. So just for time savings, I still use paper. What I am considering, and I do this after the fact now, is I'm considering marking my printed paper notes that I can put in the file and then taking a PDF, taking a picture and converting it to a PDF so that I can preach from my iPad but save the time of marking my notes on hard copy. Does that make sense? I use PDF Expert, which is a great PDF program on my iPad. I have all of Romans 1 there marked, but it's scanned from the notes that I preached from, which were hard copy like this. And so it doesn't matter to me which one I preach from. This is just quicker to do, to actually mark and to write, handwritten notes, because I'm always adding things. I don't know about you guys, but up to the very end, until I get in the pulpit. I have a thought, and it's like, boom, I want to throw that down there. And it's really hard to do that. It takes a lot more time to do that on one of the PDF programs on your iPad. So anyway, for whatever it's worth, that's what I do. So I've already formatted this template to that paper size. So you guys know, have you done this? You created templates in your word processing programs. You can create a document like this document, and then instead of saving it like just a normal document, one of the choices will be save it as a template and give it a name like I did, Sermon Paper Final or whatever you want. And then when you pull it up, it's all there. So this is how my sermon notes are structured. I put the title of the sermon up there in that font. So all I have to do when I'm ready to start entering my sermon notes, which isn't yet, but just to illustrate for you, is hit that, double-click that, and type it in, whoops, I'm not a good typist here. God's wrath, okay, just for sake of argument. Scripture. I double-click Scripture, and I type in the paragraph that this sermon, or this series of sermons, is going to be over. So it just really saves time. I like having my outline points a certain size, and I always put out next to the major outline point the verses that outline point's covering, or I lose track in my own mind as I'm preaching of what I'm doing. So anyway, but let me go to the end. I'm getting ahead of myself with sermon notes. At the end of this document, this template, I have this sheet that's full size, 8.5 by 11, and it's landscape. And I've done it that way for a particular reason, because this is where I'm going to do my block diagram. The benefit of this is I can open any sermon, for example, that I preached in Ephesians or Romans, and I can pull up, well, let me look at one here. I shouldn't show you this, but we'll do this. All right. At the end of this document, you will see, I'll do it small where you can't see it. How's that? At the end of this document, you will see the Greek text in a block diagram. It's forever saved for me. So I do that work once, and if I ever am curious, I can go back and I can look at it. It's the end of the document that has the sermon notes for that paragraph. And what I do is I don't put a different file name for every sermon. I put the section, like for example, on my computer, you'll see Romans 1:18-23. Now I preached a number of different messages from that passage, but all of them will be in that file, and at the end of that file will be the block diagram for that section. That's just the way I've chosen to do it. You can do it however you like, but that way it's easier to get around. You preach enough sermons, it's a whole lot easier to find them like this than the other way, and you know the unit of thought. You can look back, and it's quicker to review. So anyway, but at the end, what my point is here, this is the way I do block diagramming. So let's go back to the other document. So I just started studying, and let's say that I want to do, let's do Romans 3:21-24. We'll do it in English. So I copy that from my Bible software, and I paste it into this document just like that. And now all I'm going to do is go through, and I'm going to do a hard return, and I'm going to tab over to show the indent. What's supporting what? Until I get that picture you just saw in the Greek text. Okay? And that helps me understand the flow of the passage. I want to show you now, what I want to do from here is show you how to do block diagramming. Okay? How to block diagram, how to determine the relationship. Once you know the original languages well enough, I encourage you to do the block diagram in Greek or in Hebrew. But until then, as I said earlier, use a formal equivalence translation into English. New American Standard is best. It's the most literal of the ones we have, perhaps the ESV. But I've found, frankly, I like the ESV. I've just found that if I went to the ESV, I'd end up having to explain more than I have to explain now. So I'm going to stick where I am. But the key to block diagramming is to look for two. Let's go back to our to where we are here. The key to block diagramming is to look for two keys. And this is borrowed from Ramesh Richard. Did I call him Richard Ramesh before? I never can remember which of his names comes first, but it's like Bob George. Is it George Bob or is it Bob? Anyway, grammatical keys, first of all. These are usually little words or parts of words that wield a disproportionately large influence on the composition of the text. Here's some ones he identifies, just to give you some examples. Again, you're not going to get all these down. These will be on the slides. But I want you to notice there are words that indicate a change of structure, the relationship between clauses and phrases, and he's listed their meaning here. The word and, for example. When you come to the word and, it's showing that what came before and what follows it is parallel or equal, right? So that's a cue that's a clue and a cue in your thinking as you're going through the passage to say, okay, what's between those two is parallel or equal. Or, but, marks contrast. Those are really important little words. For, because, since, as, mark cause. For, because, since, as, that, mark reason. Result, that, so that, therefore, and so forth. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you glance through them and you see that these little words mark a change in the flow of thought. And that's when you're doing block diagramming, that's what you're looking for, those little words that mark a change of thought. Okay, now this idea has some relationship to what went before it. Is that relationship contrast? Is it cause? Is it reason? Is it purpose? Is it time? Is it place? Is it manner? What is the relationship of this new phrase or clause to what went before it? That's what you're looking for. All right? So that isn't a complete list. Other words will emerge, and sometimes the thought will change without one of these keywords, okay? It'll change with a participle. It'll change with a gerund or an infinitive. So you have to be flexible here. It's not like this is a technical science where every I is dotted and every T is crossed. There's a bit of art to this as well. And let me just say this. If you and I were to sit in a room and we were to each be assigned a block diagram of the same passage, we might not end up with it looking exactly alike. That's okay. The point isn't to have, there is only one right way to do this. The point is, this is capturing the flow of the apostles' thought. And so you want to be as careful and accurate as you can, but it's not like I'm going to check myself against my neighbor here and, oops, I'm wrong because he did this. Now, you may be wrong, but it may be that you both have captured the same thought just in a slightly different visual display, okay? The other thing, so you're looking for grammatical keys, these little words that have big meaning. The other thing you're looking for is content clues. And this is where I talked about like participles, other parts of speech where there's a change of some kind. There's a declaration and suddenly there's an imperative. There's repetition. There are a lot of things you're looking for. So that's where I'm saying don't just look for the little words. You're looking again for the relationship. Keep that in mind. What is the relationship of this phrase or clause to what went before it? They're all related. How are they related? And you want to break that down visually. Now, Ramesh Richard, in his book, says there are 4 steps for doing this block diagramming, for structuring the text. First of all, you identify all of the possible grammatical or content markers of structure. You go through and you mark what are the words that indicate a change? Some of the words we just looked at, possibly some other words that indicate a change in clauses or phrases. For example, here's an English example. I think he gives this in his book, if I remember right. Bob came home from work to rest because he was tired. Now, in that sentence, there are 3 markers. from, there's one of our words. It's a preposition. To, in this case, it's an infinitive, beginning an infinitive, to rest, to plus a verb. Because, there's one of those really important words. Because he was tired. 3 markers. So the first thing you do as you're looking at diagramming is you look for those key markers. Now, do you have to mark them in your text? No, I don't do that anymore. You get used to this, but he's teaching, and I think very well teaching, the sort of flow of thought. You start by looking for those markers. What are those key words that are in your passage? That was interesting. Microsoft has encountered a problem. Okay, give me a second here. Computers, you can't live with them and you can't live without them. Okay. We're close. Yeah, here we go. All right. So, step number 2. You've identified the markers in the text. Separate the major markers from the minor markers. For example, Richards writes this: just as bodies have big bones and little bones to connect and separate various parts from others, so biblical texts and all good writing feature big bones and little bones. You will use your interpretive judgments along with those of others to understand the major and minor divisions of your text. For example, in that sentence, Bob came home from work to rest because he was tired. Can you immediately see that in understanding the sentence, the word because is a far more important word than the word to, or even the word from? Why? Because it gives the reason. This is the point of the sentence. And so you're looking then to separate, as you're looking at the flow of thought, you're looking at those markers, what are the major ones that really add to the depth of the meaning of the sentence or the paragraph, and which ones don't? So you separate the major markers from the minor markers. Thirdly, you then work to understand the meaning or the force of the more major markers. As I've already noted, in the sentence, Bob came home from work to rest because he was tired. Because carries what meaning? This is reason. Reason. That's the most important one. This is the reason he came home from work. From refers to place. He came home from work. And to shows purpose. You see that? He came home from work for this purpose, to rest. Now, if this were a biblical expression, you see how just what we've done so far gives you a lot of understanding of what's going on here. You know where he's coming from. You know where he's going to. He came home. You know where he's coming from work. You know why, to rest. And you know the reason, because he was tired. Now, obviously that doesn't matter in this sentence, but if it's a biblical sentence, it matters a lot. Number 4, the 4th step, Richard mentions, is you outline the text according to the relative importance of the markers. Structuring a text helps you outline the text according to the emphasis of the author. It seeks to capture that emphasis in an outline. This is where we get to the heart of a block diagram, where we show indentation. All indentation is doing is showing relationship. Showing relationship. And then we're going to identify the nature of that relationship. Now, let me give you some examples. Okay, maybe this will get a little clearer. Let's take a very familiar verse. Ezra 7:10. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to practice it and to teach his statutes and ordinances in Israel. Now, we go through there, first of all, identifying, as he said, all the possible grammatical or content markers of structure. What's the main verb of the sentence? Had set. What's the subject of the sentence? Ezra. Ezra had set. What's the direct object? His heart. Everything, that's the main sentence. That's the independent clause that is the complete thought in the sentence. Everything else supports that. So now what we're going to try to do by marking the markers that are here is to show how everything else supports that thought. So, for, to, of, and, to, and in. Those are our markers based on what we've already learned. So we've marked them. Notice the twofold repetition of the connecting word and, relating three identical or parallel phrases. And to study, and to practice, and to teach. And then there's a third appearance of and that's different. And statutes and ordinances. But notice how just looking at the sentence this way, you automatically see that the text divides into three parts. The original author intended to communicate three basic parallel ideas. You see that? The third and simply connects two words. The earlier ands connect phrases within the verse that go back to the main independent clause. Do you see that? And so those are the kinds of things you're looking for. For in this verse relates this verse back to the previous verse. And really doesn't have much to say about the specific structure of this verse. It relates it back to what came before. To is used three times and shows how the verse is to be divided into three parts. The major marker and is used twice, once between the first and second to, and between the second and third to. So this shows how the verse is to be put together. So let's see what it looks like then. Here we go. All we've done is based on the markers we identified, we're now going to lay out a visual display of the verse showing what supports what. So you have in the natural order of the text, for. We're gonna go back to what that's doing in a minute. But there's for. Underneath for, here is what supports that. Ezra had set his heart. And then we see that to study the law is what he set his heart to do. He set his heart to study the law. So we've indented that under set his heart. Okay? Of the Lord, what is that? It's a prepositional phrase. Remember, of is a preposition. What's it talking about? The law of the Lord. So you could leave it on the same line. There's nothing wrong with that. Or if you want to give a larger visual picture, you indent it as I've done under law. And what is and referring back to? He set his heart to study and parallel to practice it. And parallel again to teach. His statutes and ordinances, that's what he's teaching. So I indented it under teach. His statutes. And is another parallel, so it's another way of saying, or a related way of saying statutes. There is a difference, and in your study you'd get into that. But the point is, they're parallel grammatically. You want to capture the grammatical parallelism. And in Israel, what's in Israel? Another prepositional phrase saying where he's going to teach. So therefore, I've indented it under teach. Now, there you have a block diagram. It's the natural order of the text. You're identifying the major markers and the minor markers in the flow of the writer's thought, and then you are indenting what modifies under what it modifies. Now, when I glance at this, just take a look at that for a moment. That'll preach, guys. Okay? All we've done is simply try to capture the the syntax, the relationship between phrases and clauses. And so it is what is this? Oh, okay.
When's your next break so Pastor John can talk to you?
It's coming up here in the next 5 minutes or so.
Great.
Okay, thanks. Is that okay? Is that okay? All right. So you see, I hope that means I didn't say anything wrong. So you see the visible display here, okay? What I want you to see is it lays out beautifully by doing this. Now I know what is important and what is supporting. Now, let's take the next step. Remember those 4 steps that he gave us? Let's go to the next step. Now I'm going to actually work to identify the relationship of those clauses and phrases to one another. So I'm gonna come up with, okay, what is that relationship? So let's take this. For. What's the word for? It's because, it's reason. Now, that means this verse is an explanation of, a reason for what comes before it in the previous verse. What comes before it in the previous verse? The good hand of his God was upon him because, for this reason. And then you'll notice that Ezra had set his heart. That's the main proposition. That's the main idea of the sentence, that Ezra had set his heart. There's some great work I can do with the individual Hebrew word there to understand what that means, what is heart, what does it mean to set your heart, etc. Who is Ezra? I need to look into that. I need to make sure I understand who he is, but that's the main idea of the sentence. Then, to study the law, that's the goal. That's the goal of his setting his heart. When he set his heart, it was for this goal, to study the law, and specifically the law of the Lord, and to practice it, goal number 2, and to teach it, goal number 3. His statutes, that really is referring back to, it's the content of the law. To study the law. It goes back to explain or to further illuminate what he meant by law. And ordinance, again, another synonym with nuances I want to understand, going back to what is the law. In Israel, to whom or where? So now I have, just by virtue of that block diagram, I have a great start at understanding the flow of the author's thought. And I haven't created this, guys. We didn't do this. We simply captured what the writer did. That's the beauty of this. Yes, sir?
You said you started with this on Monday morning when you get ready. You start with the diagram.
That's right. When I'm coming to a new paragraph, okay? So I'm sitting down, I'm coming to a new paragraph. This is the first thing I do, is I do the block diagram, because I think this helps me come to the theme, which is the next step. What is the theme of this paragraph? Well, doing this helps me see the theme because it shows me the major ideas that the author had. So I could say, well, the first thing I do is I read through the paragraph and I come up with a preliminary theme. And in some senses we do that, right? I mean, you already have an idea, but I don't think that comes first. I think what really comes first is doing this because, again, meaning is in the relationship of those phrases and clauses to each other. And so once I understand that relationship, I've got the meaning. And now I'm in a position to say, well, I think the theme of this paragraph is, okay, and I've done it with a sentence, with a verse, because, it's harder to get a long paragraph on here, but it works the same way with a paragraph. Yes, sir?
Stylistically, for example, in Romans 1, where you have 7 verses that are one sentence, and Paul keeps building and building and building on his thought. As far as like the page goes, how do you keep it going
Yeah, you make the text smaller.
5.4.
You just keep making the font smaller. But I still want to capture the flow of his thought. If that's what he's doing, and Paul does that sometimes, he'll start a sentence. I mean, you got 10 verses in Ephesians 2 that's one sentence. And I mean, it just, it keeps going out here. Sometimes it'll go back to the left-hand margin, another main idea. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes it'll keep going. But that's okay, because I'm still, in my mind, now getting a picture of what Paul was doing. And that's what I want. That's what I'm after. This isn't about creating something for me. I can pull, I'll show you, we're going to talk about how to pull a preaching outline that, or I shouldn't say pull, that's not an accurate word. How to come up with a preaching outline that isn't your own outline. It simply reflects this. So the first thing I want to do is capture the flow of the author's thought. And then when I'm preaching, I want to show my congregation the author's flow of thought by making my outline reflect what he's done. But this shows me what he's done.